freeze it right there. That is me still in my flight suit at midnight on Christmas Eve on my own porch, looking at a foreclosure notice with my mother-in-law's handwriting in the margin. 12 hours earlier, I had kept an injured airman alive at altitude. Remember this porch, because to understand how I ended up locked out in the cold by my own family, and why the quietest person in the room is the last one you should cross, I have to take you back. My name is Sarah. I am 47 years old, and I am a major in the United States Air Force. For 20 years, I have served as an aeromedical evacuation flight nurse stationed at Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California. My job is simple to explain, but heavy to execute. When a service member is critically hurt across the globe, my team turns the belly of a cargo plane into a flying intensive care unit. At 30,000 feet, with turbulence shaking the airframe, you do not have the luxury of panic. You assess the vitals. You stabilize the bleeding. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. You rely on facts over feelings. But back on the ground, in the quiet suburbs of Northern California, facts were constantly being distorted. My husband was a decent man with a fatal flaw. He lived entirely in the shadow of his mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was the kind of woman who ran her extended family like a hostile corporate takeover. She had ironclad opinions on everything, from the shade of our living room curtains to the way I managed our household budget. To Eleanor, my military career was just a quaint little hobby. She liked to tell her wealthy friends that I was just a caregiver. In her eyes, I was merely a housewife who occasionally played dress-up in a green flight suit, leaving her poor son to fend for himself. People like Eleanor think that if you do not shout, if you do not command the center of attention at every dinner party, you must be weak. They mistake operational restraint for simple compliance. Tell me below if you have ever had someone mistake your quiet patience for weakness. I never argued with her. I simply set my coffee mug on the table and let the insult hang in the air. Not because I agreed with her, because I refused to fight a loud battle over something so small. My husband and I had bought our home in Fairfield 5 years prior. It was a beautiful, sprawling property with a wide wraparound porch and an ancient oak tree in the front yard. It was our sanctuary. I had put down $85,000 from my own deployment savings, and I paid exactly half of the mortgage every month. My name was right there on the deed. Eleanor deeply despised that arrangement. She believed property should be kept strictly in the bloodline. She saw me as a temporary contractor in her son's life, not a partner. She would drop heavy hints during Sunday dinners about estate planning and asset protection, staring right through me while she poured the wine. I usually let it slide. Sometimes ignoring a bully keeps the peace. Sometimes it just gives them time to lay down a minefield. It was the second week of December. The weather in Fairfield had turned bitter and wet. I was downstairs in the kitchen making a pot of coffee before heading to the base. The house was unnervingly quiet. Then I heard a voice. It was my husband, standing in his home office down the hall. The door was cracked open an inch. He was on speakerphone. His voice was hushed, tight, and defensive. I stopped in the hallway. I could hear Eleanor's sharp, commanding tone leaking through the phone speaker. She was telling him that they were running out of time. She said they needed to protect the deed to the house before my negligence ruined his financial future. I held my breath, waiting for my husband to tell his mother to stop. Instead, I heard him sigh. He told her she was right, but that I would never sign the transfer papers. Eleanor laughed. It was a cold, practiced sound. She told him he would not need my permission. Before I could push the door open and demand an explanation, my own cell phone began to vibrate in my pocket. It was my squadron commander. The holiday rotation schedule had just fractured. Sudden mandatory orders had dropped. I was deploying immediately. I answered the call right there in the hallway. My squadron commander's voice crackled through the receiver, clipping every syllable. A mass casualty transport mission was spinning up overseas. They were short a senior flight nurse. I had exactly 3 hours to pack my mobility bags, report to the flight line, and be ready for wheels up. I was going to miss Christmas. I pushed the home office door open. My husband jolted in his desk chair. He instantly tapped his phone screen, cutting off his mother mid-sentence. I did not yell. I simply looked at him and asked what deed transfer they were talking about. He refused to meet my eyes. He started shuffling some mail on his desk, his voice defensive and thin. He claimed it was just his mother worrying about taxes. He said she had read an article about new property laws and was spinning out over nothing. She just thought a family trust would protect his assets. I told him that if a single financial document was filed regarding that property, I needed to see it. He swore up and down that he would never make a move without me. He looked sincere, but his hands were shaking. An hour later, I was hauling my green canvas duffel bags down the stairs. Packing is muscle memory. 4 sets of flight suits, heavy boots, thermal layers, and my trauma kits. As I checked the zippers, the front door swung open. Eleanor walked in without knocking. She had a spare key I had never authorized. She was wearing a perfectly tailored wool coat, holding a thick, pristine manila folder against her chest. She looked at my heavy boots and my packed gear with a tight, condescending smile. She sighed dramatically, loudly lamenting how terrible it was that I was abandoning my family right before the holidays. She smoothed her coat and told her son not to worry about a thing. She said she would stay close and help him manage the house. Then she patted the manila folder. She looked right at me and said she would handle all the tedious bank paperwork while I was gone, so I could go play my little war games without distraction. She said her son and I clearly struggled with the complexities of wealth management, and she was stepping in to fix it. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She was laying the groundwork right to my face. She thought I was too simple to understand what a hostile maneuver looked like. My husband stood perfectly still in the kitchen doorway, staring at the floor. He did not defend me. He did not tell his mother to leave. He just folded his arms and let her run the room. That was the tragedy of our marriage. He was not a malicious man, but he was entirely hollow under pressure. He would always take the path of least resistance, and Eleanor was a force of nature. I zipped my jacket. I told Eleanor the only bank paperwork we had was a mortgage that I paid half of. Then I picked up my bags, walked out the front door, and drove to the base. The flight line at Travis Air Force Base was a chaotic symphony of jet engines and floodlights. The freezing California wind whipped across the tarmac as my crew loaded medical supplies into the massive gray belly of a C-17 Globemaster. Once the cargo doors began to lower, the reality of my husband's hushed phone call gnawed at me. The pieces were aligning, and they painted an ugly picture. She wanted the house in a trust she controlled. She wanted my name erased. And she was going to use my deployment to pressure him into signing a refinance. I pulled out my phone. I typed a direct message to him. I told him not to sign a single piece of paper with his mother while I was in the air. I hit send. I stood on the ramp in the dim light of the aircraft cabin and stared at the screen. 3 minutes passed. The read receipt appeared beneath my message. He had seen it. I waited for the typing bubble. I waited for a promise. Nothing came. The aircraft engines roared to life, shaking the metal deck beneath my boots. The cell service dropped to 0. I was officially out of reach, and I had just left my home completely unguarded. The next 2 weeks were a blur of jet fuel, sterile gauze, and sleep deprivation. Our operating tempo was relentless. We were staging out of a temporary airbase overseas, flying aeromedical evacuation routes to pull wounded personnel out of forward operating areas. When you're in the air, balancing a patient's crashing blood pressure against the violent turbulence of a cargo deck, the rest of the world ceases to exist. You operate in a tunnel. The mission is the only reality. But whenever the aircraft landed and the engine spooled down, the silence of the transient barracks rushed back in. And with the silence came the dread. Communication with home was fractured. We had limited access to base networks. I had to rely on a bulky satellite phone checked out from the communications tent. My schedule meant I was usually trying to call Fairfield at 3 a.m. Pacific time. Every time I managed to connect a call to my husband, the conversation was bizarrely strained. He had always been a talker, but now he was evasive. He gave me one-word answers. He rushed to get off the line. I asked him point blank about the hushed conversation I had overheard in the hallway. I asked if Eleanor had brought over any property paperwork. There was a heavy pause on the line. The satellite delay made the silence stretch out agonizingly. When he finally spoke, his defensive tone told me everything. He told me I was being paranoid. He muttered about how his mother was simply helping him secure some legacy planning. He started using phrases I knew he had never researched himself. He talked about liability protection and unified asset management. It was unnatural. He was parroting Eleanor word for word. She had isolated him, worn him down, and convinced him that I was the enemy. I tried to push him. I reminded him that we had a fixed-rate mortgage and absolutely no reason to alter our deed. He snapped at me over the static. He said I was always trying to control things and that he was perfectly capable of handling the finances without my permission. He terminated the connection. It was the first time in our marriage he had ever ended a call in anger. I sat on a metal folding chair outside the Tactical Operations Center, staring at the satellite phone. The cold rain soaked through my uniform jacket. He had caved. The hushed argument on the morning I left was not a debate. It was a surrender. But what exactly had he signed? I could not check our joint bank accounts because the base network was restricted. I was effectively blind. Overconfident antagonists always rely on distance to cover their tracks. They assume that if you cannot see the paperwork, you cannot fight the process. The days ticked closer to Christmas. The exhaustion set in deep. It was the 23rd of December, and my crew was put on immediate alert status. A winter storm was hammering the region, and we were tasked with a critical transport flight. I was sitting in the base terminal, drinking bitter black coffee, waiting for the flight brief. My personal cell phone was connected to the terminal's weak wireless network. Suddenly, the screen lit up with a push notification. It was an automated alert from the banking institution that held our home mortgage. The subject line was sterile and terrifying. It read, "Notification of account closure and title transfer." I tapped the message. My heart hammered against my ribs. The email stated that our existing mortgage had been fully paid off through a third-party refinance. It confirmed that the property title had been legally transferred to a new entity. My name was gone. The mortgage I had paid into for 5 years was erased. To execute a full refinance and a title transfer on a jointly owned property in the state of California, both legal spouses must sign the release documents in the presence of a notary public. I had been flying over the ocean. I had not signed a single page. A wave of cold, sharp anger washed over me. I realized exactly what Eleanor had done. She had not just pressured him into a bad financial decision. She had executed a hostile takeover of my home. I stood up, ready to dial my husband and demand the truth. But before I could unlock the keypad, the shrill, ear-piercing wail of the bass klaxon shattered the quiet of the terminal. The overhead speakers crackled to life. It was a mass casualty alert. We had incoming wounded critical status requiring immediate tactical evacuation. The screen of my phone faded to black. The betrayal would have to wait. I shoved my phone deep into my flight suit pocket. The klaxon was screaming, and the reality of that email notification had to be locked in a mental box. The mission required total focus. If I brought my personal panic onto that aircraft, people would die. We sprinted across the rain-slicked tarmac. The engines of the C-17 were already whining with a low, bone-rattling vibration. We loaded 3 critically injured service members from a forward staging area. 2 were stabilized on litters, while the third required continuous monitoring. As the massive jet broke through the heavy winter storm and leveled out at 30,000 feet, the cargo bay settled into a rhythmic, deafening hum. 2 hours into the flight, I was checking an intravenous line when a sharp metallic pop echoed from the forward avionics compartment. Then the master warning alarms began to shriek. The aircraft banked hard, dropping altitude fast. The main cabin lights flickered and died. The red emergency strobes began to pulse. Thick, toxic gray smoke began pouring from the forward bulkhead, rolling aggressively across the ceiling. In a pressurized aluminum tube packed with pure oxygen lines, an uncontained electrical fire is a worst-case scenario. The loadmaster shouted over the intercom that the primary fire suppression system in that compartment had failed. The pilots initiated an emergency dive. The angle of the deck pitched severely. Through the banking smoke, I heard frantic coughing from the front of the aircraft. 2 loadmasters had been securing gear near the avionics panel when it blew. They were trapped behind a wall of dense, acrid smoke. One had collapsed entirely. The other was pinned, disoriented and choking, unable to drag his crewmate clear. Panic is a virus. It spreads faster than fire. But panic is loud, and action is quiet. I didn't wait for an order. I grabbed a portable oxygen bottle and shoved an emergency breathing hood over my head. I unclipped my safety harness and moved forward into the gray wall. The heat radiating from the metal panels was blistering. I couldn't see my own hands. I navigated by touch, feeling along the bulkhead until my heavy boot hit the pinned loadmaster. I shoved his emergency mask into place, grabbed the thick nylon webbing of his flight vest, and hauled him backward out of the hazard zone and into the clear air of the main bay. I immediately turned around and crawled back into the thickest part of the smoke. My lungs burned. The aircraft shuddered violently. I found the unconscious airman face down on the deck. I anchored my boots against a floor ring, grabbed his drag handle, and pulled his heavy weight 20 feet across the grooved metal floor, completely blind, until my medical technician grabbed my shoulder and helped me lift him onto a secure litter. The pilots managed to isolate the electrical circuit choking off the fire just as we leveled out for an emergency landing at a diversion base in Germany. Both men survived. Their lungs were clear because I pulled them out before the toxic exposure turned lethal. When the adrenaline finally faded, I was sitting in a sterile debriefing room. My hands were shaking, and my flight suit smelled of chemical smoke. The flight surgeon stood at the front of the room. He pointed at me, detailing exactly what had happened in the smoke, and stated that he was submitting the paperwork for the Airman's Medal. It is a rare honor given by the Air Force for heroism involving voluntary risk of life under conditions other than those of conflict. Eleanor liked to tell her country club friends that I was a housewife who played dress-up. I wondered if she had ever pulled a grown man out of a burning fuselage. How would this medal change the power dynamic back home? I was about to find out. I walked out of the briefing and found a quiet desk in the transient terminal. The mission was complete. It was time to look at the documents Eleanor thought I would never see. I borrowed a secure laptop from the communications desk, bypassed the local firewall, and typed my credentials into my civilian bank portal. The screen loaded. I clicked on the tab for my home mortgage. A bright red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. I refreshed the page. I pulled up my joint checking account, searching for a transaction history. There was a single transfer note. My entire mortgage had been paid off by a third party. The account was permanently shut down. In its place, a digital tax document listed the property as legally transferred to a new entity called the Eleanor Family Revocable Trust. I was completely locked out. I had no house, no mortgage, and no legal standing. The transit back to California felt like an eternity. I was seated in the cavernous cargo bay of a heavy military transport, staring out a tiny porthole at the black ocean below. My commander had ordered me home early for mandatory crew rest following the in-flight emergency. The red access denied message from the banking portal burned in my mind the entire flight. We touched down at Travis Air Force Base late on Christmas Eve. The base was a ghost town. A freezing winter rain was washing across the tarmac, turning the floodlights into blurred halos. I signed out of the squadron, threw my green mobility bags into the trunk of my car, and drove straight toward my house in Fairfield. The suburban streets were quiet, lined with blinking holiday lights. But when my headlights swept across my own driveway, I saw nothing but darkness. The ancient oak tree in the front yard stood like a shadow. The front windows were black. The porch light was off. My husband's car was gone. I put the vehicle in park. I walked up the concrete steps, the freezing wind cutting through my flight jacket, and then I saw it. Taped directly over the brass deadbolt of my front door was a thick, legal envelope. We have arrived exactly where we started. Freeze it right there. This is the moment. This is me standing in my flight suit at midnight on Christmas Eve on my own porch, reading a foreclosure notice with my mother-in-law's handwriting in the margin. The printed notice stated that the property, now under the legal ownership of the Eleanor Family Revocable Trust, was in severe default on a massive private bridge loan. The trust had failed to make a balloon payment, and the lender was seizing the asset. The occupants had exactly 3 days to vacate the premises. In the top right margin of the notice, written in bright blue ink, was a note in Eleanor's immaculate slanting script. The note simply read, "The house is lost. Pack your bags quietly. Do not embarrass the family." The betrayal crystallized instantly. She had engineered a deliberate default. She had pressured my husband into transferring the deed to a trust she controlled, completely erasing my name. Then she had immediately restructured the debt, pulling the equity out and attaching a predatory loan to the home. She had intentionally missed the very first payment, triggering an immediate, aggressive foreclosure. The timing was brutally efficient. Let the property fall into default over the holiday weekend while I was deployed. Her son would be forced to move back into her sprawling estate, financially broken and entirely dependent on her again. And I would return from an overseas mission to find the locks changed, the banks closed, and my life dismantled. I stood there on the porch in the freezing dark. A normal reaction would be to panic. I was supposed to melt down, call my husband in tears, or pound my fists against the door. I was supposed to act like the emotional, unstable housewife she told everyone I was. But when you operate at 30,000 feet, panic is a waste of oxygen. You do not argue with a crisis. You triage the problem. I did not touch the door handle. I stepped back, took out my phone, and turned on the flash. I took clear, high-resolution photographs of every single page. I documented the foreclosure stamp. I zoomed in on Eleanor's handwritten note in the margin. Then I walked back down the steps, climbed into the driver's seat of my car, and turned on the dome light. I unclipped the heavy packet of legal documents attached to the notice and started reading the small print. I needed to find the mechanism. In the state of California, how did they legally close my mortgage and execute a title transfer without my consent? Overconfident antagonists always leave a trail. They assume you are too intimidated to check their work. I flipped to page 14 of the county filings. It was a spousal consent and waiver form. The document stated that I, as an equal joint owner of the property, fully relinquished all rights to the deed. At the bottom of the page, there was a signature line. My name was written in blue ink. It was a sloppy, hurried scrawl, but the loops on the letters were sharp and precise. I held the form up to the dome light. I compared the signature directly to Eleanor's handwritten note in the margin of the eviction notice. The heavy loops on the capital letters matched perfectly. The aggressive slant was identical. It was a blatant forgery. Eleanor had signed my name. I sat in the idling car, staring at the blue ink on the spousal consent form. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. Eleanor had not even bothered to hire someone to fake my name. She had just picked up a pen and executed real estate forgery herself, assuming I would simply fold. She thought she was playing a game against a helpless caregiver. She forgot that I spend my entire career managing critical failures. When a patient's vitals crash, you do not yell at the monitor. You gather the chart, you find the source of the bleeding, and you stop it. I did not drive to Eleanor's sprawling estate to confront them. Anger is loud. Strategy is quiet. The element of surprise is the strongest asset in any confrontation. If I alerted them now, Eleanor would immediately begin covering her tracks. I booked a cheap room at a roadside motel near the base, paying in cash. I sat on the edge of the rigid mattress, booted up my laptop, and went to work. I downloaded our original joint tax returns. I pulled the initial mortgage agreement bearing my actual authenticated signature. I compiled my deployment orders, proving I was geographically over the ocean when the fraudulent document was supposedly notarized. Early the next morning, I drove straight back to the base legal office. The heavy wooden doors of the Judge Advocate General building were locked for the holiday, but I knew the duty roster. An old ally of mine, an aggressive, razor-sharp major named Miller, was pulling the holiday staff watch. He had spent years untangling financial abuse cases for deployed service members. I knocked on the heavy glass window. He looked up from his desk, surprised, and buzzed me in. I walked into his office, set my folder on his desk, and told him I needed to declare a financial emergency involving a fraudulent property seizure. He poured 2 cups of black coffee and opened the file. He traced his finger over the foreclosure notice, then stopped hard when he reached the spousal consent form. He held the forged signature up to the light, comparing it to my military identification card. Then he pulled up the state notary registry on his terminal. It took him less than 10 minutes to break the scheme wide open. The notary public who had stamped the spousal waiver was an old country club friend of Eleanor's. The woman had illegally stamped a document I was never present to sign. The bank records showed the digital address used to close my mortgage account traced directly back to Eleanor's primary residence. Major Miller looked at me across the desk. He confirmed that since I was actively deployed under federal orders at the exact time this document was processed, the entire transaction was a federal crime. With the legal trap armed, I finally dialed my husband. He answered on the second ring. His voice sounded thin and panicked. He asked where I was. He claimed he had gone to stay at his mother's house because the heating system at our place had failed. He was lying. The house was empty because they were locked out by the default. I told him I was in town and that he needed to meet me at a diner near the base in 20 minutes. I told him to come alone. When he walked into the diner, he looked exhausted. He sat across from me and immediately started rambling about how his mother was handling a complex tax issue for us. I did not argue. I simply slid the forged spousal consent form across the table. He stared at the document. The color completely drained from his face. His hands began to shake. I told him exactly what his mother had done. I explained the trust, the predatory bridge loan, the immediate default, and the forgery. He broke down right there in the booth. He admitted his mother swore it was just a legal maneuver to lower our property taxes. She promised him everything was legitimate. He had signed a stack of papers without reading them, but he swore he had never seen the waiver with my name on it. I looked at him and delivered the absolute bottom line. I told him I refused to let him off the hook for his blind compliance. I told him he had to make a choice before morning. He could either stand with me and tell the truth, or he could stand with Eleanor and face the federal consequences alongside her. He sat frozen in the diner booth, staring at the blue ink on the page. The protective bubble his mother had built around him completely shattered. The choice I gave him was simple, but it forced him to tear down 40 years of absolute obedience. He finally looked up, his eyes red and exhausted. He told me he was done. He chose me. He agreed to provide a sworn written statement to the military legal office, detailing exactly how Eleanor had manipulated the entire process, and swearing he had never seen that spousal consent form. The first piece of the defense was secured, but a confession alone was not enough to stop the machinery Eleanor had set in motion. The legal reality of a default is ruthless. The clock was aggressively ticking. The private lender was set to finalize the property seizure and lock down the title by noon on Monday immediately following the Christmas weekend. If the paperwork processed untangling the fraudulent deed through a civilian court could take years of brutal litigation and drain our entire life savings, we needed an anvil to drop. We needed immediate, overwhelming authority to force the civilian bank to freeze the process. Major Miller and I escalated the situation. We needed to bypass the standard legal crawl. When a service member's stability is directly attacked through financial fraud while they are actively deployed, the base command structure steps in with heavy federal weight. Major Miller requested an immediate closed-door review with our wing commander. The colonel was a stern, deeply respected combat veteran who had spent 30 years protecting the troops under his command. He absolutely despised predatory tactics targeting his airmen. I stood at attention in the colonel's office as he reviewed the financial dossier. He traced the bank transfer records, the timeline of my deployment orders, and the blatantly forged notary stamp. Then he opened my operational personnel file. He studied the initial flight surgeon report from the aircraft fire over the Atlantic. He saw the official approved citation for the Airman's Medal. The colonel looked up from his heavy mahogany desk. His expression hardened into absolute stone. He stated that it was profoundly unacceptable for an officer to return from saving lives in a burning fuselage only to find her own family had stolen her home. He instructed the military legal team to draft a formal federal injunction under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, citing active deployment fraud. This would freeze the bank's actions entirely. Then the colonel looked at me and asked if Eleanor was planning to attend the squadron's holiday homecoming ceremony on the flight line the next morning. I told him she never missed a chance to stand on the tarmac and play the devoted military mother for a captive audience. She loved the pageantry of military life, especially when she thought she was in total control of the narrative. The colonel nodded slowly. He told me to show up in my full-service dress uniform, and he would handle the rest. The trap was quietly, perfectly set. That evening, I sat alone in my motel room, pressing the creases of my uniform trousers. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text message from Eleanor. She could not resist taking a final victory lap. The tone of her message was dripping with false, patronizing pity. She wrote that she assumed I had finally seen the notice on the door, and that she was deeply sorry my financial negligence had cost us the house. Then she delivered her final demand. She told me the squadron family homecoming was the next morning. She stated that she and her son would be attending to proudly represent the family. She told me to pack my bags quietly, skip the ceremony, and leave town before I humiliated myself and embarrassed them all. She actually believed she had won. She believed her wealth and her loud voice made her untouchable. She assumed I was just a defeated, displaced housewife who would slink away, too intimidated by her social standing to fight back. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. I did not reply. Christmas morning broke over Northern California with a bitter, biting chill. A thin layer of frost covered the massive gray hangars at Travis Air Force Base. Out on the flight line, the towering silhouette of a C-17 Globemaster sat static against the pale winter sky. The tarmac was already teeming with hundreds of families. Spouses and children were bundled in heavy coats, clutching thermal mugs of coffee and handmade welcome home signs, waiting behind the metal barricades for the returning aeromedical crews. I arrived early. I was wearing my full-service dress uniform. The dark blue wool was immaculately pressed. The silver oak leaves of a major were pinned sharply to my shoulders. I stood near the back of the hangar, blending into the shadows of a parked fuel truck, quietly observing the crowd. Right on schedule, Eleanor made her entrance. She walked onto the tarmac like she held the deed to the entire military installation. She wore a pristine, cream-colored cashmere coat and a bright silk scarf. She immediately began working the crowd, carrying a silver thermos of hot chocolate and handing out practiced, camera-ready smiles. She was loudly playing the role of the gracious, devoted matriarch. My husband walked 3 paces behind her. He looked physically ill. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He kept scanning the perimeter, terrified of what was about to happen. But he kept his mouth shut. He was following my instructions. I watched Eleanor corner a group of junior officers' wives near the very front of the barricades. Her voice carried easily over the cold wind. She was holding court. She let out a dramatic, performative sigh, complaining about how exhausting it was to hold a family together when some women insisted on playing war games instead of tending to their actual homes. She leaned in closer to a young lieutenant's wife. She loudly whispered that it was a tragedy her son was forced to manage a massive financial default entirely on his own, simply because his wife was a careless caregiver who had abandoned her real responsibilities. She was publicly establishing her narrative. She was burying me in front of the squadron before I even had a chance to speak. She was absolutely certain she had won. She assumed I was currently sitting in a cheap roadside motel packing my bags in total humiliating defeat. I did not step forward to correct her. I simply waited in the shadows. When an arrogant antagonist is digging their own grave in a public venue, you never interrupt them. You let them finish the trench. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the hangar alarm sounded, signaling the start of the formal homecoming ceremony. The heavy cargo doors of the aircraft lowered. The returning crews marched onto the flight line, met with a massive, echoing wave of cheers. Once the formation halted and the initial applause settled, the wing commander walked out of the hangar. The colonel was a towering, deeply respected combat veteran. He strode toward a wooden podium set up at the center of the tarmac, flanked by the senior flight surgeon. The crowd immediately hushed. Eleanor pushed her way to the absolute front line. She stood tall, beaming with artificial pride, eager to be recognized as the perfect military mother. She offered the colonel a polite, confident nod as he approached the microphone. The colonel stared right through her. His expression was as cold as the concrete under our boots. He held a thick red legal folder in his left hand and a small, dark blue velvet presentation box in his right. He tapped the microphone. The sound cracked sharply across the flight line. He welcomed the families and commended the squadron for their relentless operational tempo. He spoke about the brutal reality of aeromedical evacuation and the quiet strength required to do the job. Eleanor nodded along eagerly, completely oblivious to the trap she was standing in. Then the colonel's voice dropped an octave. It turned hard and precise. He announced that before he dismissed the crews to their families, there was an official matter of profound gravity that required immediate public attention. The colonel opened the red legal folder on the podium. He squared his broad shoulders. Then his eyes scanned the front row. He did not look at the returning pilots. He did not look at the base chaplains. His eyes locked directly onto Eleanor. The silence on the flight line was absolute. The cold morning wind whipped off the tarmac, snapping the heavy canvas flags behind the podium. The wing commander stood rigid, his gaze locked entirely on Eleanor in the front row. Eleanor shifted her weight. She pulled her cashmere coat tighter around her shoulders. She glanced nervously at my husband, who was staring straight at the frozen concrete, completely immobile. She assumed the colonel was going to address a standard family readiness matter. She had no idea her own digital footprint was documented inside that red legal folder. The colonel leaned into the microphone. His voice echoed across the massive expanse of the tarmac, carrying the full, crushing weight of military authority. He stated that the military demands honor not just in combat, but in the quiet, unseen spaces where trust is built. He declared that it is a profound disgrace when a service member's trust is exploited by those who claim to support them, especially while that service member is forward deployed. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor swallowed hard. Her hands gripped the metal barricade tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She was beginning to realize that the atmosphere had shifted, but she still believed I was safely defeated, packing my bags in a cheap motel. Then the colonel raised his voice. He called my name and rank, ordering me to step forward and post. I stepped out from the shadow of the massive fuel truck. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path. I walked a straight, perfectly measured line toward the center of the tarmac, my heavy boots echoing sharply against the concrete. When Eleanor saw me, all the blood completely drained from her face. She physically recoiled. Her jaw dropped. The smug, untouchable matriarch evaporated in an instant. The raw panic of a cornered criminal replaced her carefully constructed mask. She stared at my pressed blue uniform, her eyes darting to the silver oak leaves on my shoulders as if they were weapons drawn against her. She did not expect a military officer marching forward under the direct command of a colonel. I halted, 6 feet in front of the podium, snapped to attention, and rendered a sharp textbook salute. The colonel returned it immediately. He unlatched the small blue velvet box resting on the podium. He turned back to the crowd, his voice booming across the flight line. He announced that on the 23rd of December, high above the Atlantic Ocean, a catastrophic electrical fire broke out in the forward avionics compartment of a heavily loaded military aircraft. He signaled to the senior flight surgeon, who stepped forward and began to read from an official military citation. The flight surgeon detailed the exact events of the in-flight emergency. He described the violent emergency dive, the failing altitude, and the dense, toxic smoke filling the cabin. He described 2 loadmasters trapped and choking behind a wall of blistering heat. The crowd was completely silent. The young wives Eleanor had been lecturing moments earlier turned to stare at her with deep, sudden disgust. They realized exactly who she had been insulting. The flight surgeon stated clearly for the entire squadron to hear how I had secured a portable oxygen tank, entered a zero-visibility hazard zone without hesitation, and dragged 2 unconscious men to clear air while the airframe shuddered violently. He finished reading the citation. The entire formation stood at rigid attention. The colonel stepped back to the microphone. He looked directly down at Eleanor, who was now trembling visibly in the front row, completely exposed in front of the very social circle she had tried to dominate. The colonel delivered the absolute crushing validation line. His voice was like a hammer striking an anvil. He stared directly into Eleanor's panicked eyes and stated that he had reviewed a federal injunction freezing a fraudulent property seizure executed while this officer was actively saving lives. Then he leaned into the microphone. "This officer earned the Airman's Medal pulling 2 crewmen out of a burning fuselage," the colonel said. "Housewife is not the word. Major is the word." Eleanor flinched as if she had been physically struck. The underestimation she had built her entire narrative around was permanently, publicly shattered by a respected authority figure in front of hundreds of witnesses. The untouchable image she had curated for decades collapsed into dust. Her money and her loud opinions meant absolutely nothing on this tarmac. The colonel stepped off the podium and firmly pinned the heavy polished bronze medal to my uniform jacket. Then he reached over and picked up the thick, red legal folder. He handed it directly to me. He did not smile. He gave me a single, firm nod, completely authorizing me to finish the mission. I turned away from the podium. The entire formation stood in absolute silence. Hundreds of pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I walked straight toward the metal barricade where Eleanor was standing. She looked entirely diminished. The heavy cream-colored cashmere coat hung loose on her shoulders. Her face was ashen, completely drained of the arrogant, mocking confidence she had worn like armor for decades. My husband stood beside her. He did not look away from me. He squared his shoulders, took a deliberate step away from his mother, and stood firmly on his own. He had made his choice. The quiet compliance that had nearly destroyed our marriage was gone. I stopped right in front of Eleanor. I did not yell. I did not insult her. I operated with the exact same clinical detachment I used to triage a patient at 30,000 feet. Revenge is loud and chaotic. Accountability is quiet, permanent, and absolutely devastating. I opened the thick red legal folder the colonel had handed me. I pulled out the stack of bank records, the federal injunction, and the spousal consent form bearing the blatantly forged signature. I handed the documents directly over the barricade into Eleanor's trembling hands. I kept my voice low, ensuring only she and my husband could hear the final terms. I told her the federal injunction had already frozen the predatory loan and shattered the default. I explained that the military legal office had traced the digital signature stamps directly to her home internet address, and the civilian notary was already cooperating with federal investigators. Then I delivered the absolute bottom line. I told her the fraudulent trust would be dissolved immediately. She would quietly pay every single legal and penalty fee required to unwind her own hostile takeover entirely out of her own pocket. The property deed would be fully restored to its original joint status by the end of the week. I watched her eyes scan the heavy federal seals on the documents. She realized I was not bluffing. The military had built an ironclad case of active deployment fraud, and she was trapped in a corner she could not buy her way out of. I told her that if she hesitated for a single day or attempted one legal countermove, I would personally walk the forgery evidence to a federal prosecutor before the new year. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak. She desperately wanted to offer some practiced, slippery excuse, but nothing came out. The evidence was absolute. She slowly closed her mouth, tightened her grip on the red folder, turned, and walked away through the silent crowd. She looked completely defeated, a wealthy woman retreating into the cold morning air. That afternoon, my husband and I returned to Fairfield. The winter sun broke through the heavy clouds, casting a warm light across my driveway. I walked up the concrete steps to the wide wraparound porch. I peeled the remaining tape from the foreclosure notice off my front door and threw it in the trash. I walked inside, took off my heavy uniform jacket, and started a fresh pot of coffee. The house was safe. The airspace was completely clear. My husband and I had a long, difficult road ahead of us to repair the trust in our marriage. Trust is not a switch you can just flip back on. But for the first time, we were standing on honest ground. He finally understood that avoiding a conflict does not protect a family. It just hands the keys to the enemy. We often convince ourselves that the loudest people hold all the power. We let the bullies run the room because we are too exhausted to fight the noise. We mistake their aggression for absolute authority. But true strength is not measured by who shouts the loudest. True strength is found in the quiet discipline required to hold your ground, gather the facts, and wait for the precise moment to deploy the truth. The people who underestimate the quiet ones eventually realize that a storm does not need to make a sound before it levels everything in its path. Would you have forgiven the sun for wavering? Tell me below. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones turn out to be the strongest in the room.